Hello and welcome to Only As Lonely, my podcast where I share my story of back in 2009 where I went travelling around the world on my own and played a bit of music, took some photos and all the funny little interactions in between. So here we are, day 3. We are in New York still. I hope you're enjoying this if you're with me. We're on this together. This is a journey together now. What happened yesterday? Well, I saw the Empire State Building, Madison Square Garden, did a bit of the sightseeing thing, almost got robbed. Went to a comedy club, that was good. Met a fellow Brit who was an absolute arsehole. And got a good roommate, cellmate with Louis, nice chap. It's day 3 and it's absolutely chucking it down. So I'm going to continue to use this New York pass strategically to try to avoid the rain. Please continue to follow the onlyaslonely.wordpress.com to see the photos and clips from along the trip. And please like and share and spread the word if you're enjoying this. So shall we just jump straight into it? Don't want to faff around too much. Let's just crack on, shall we? Here we go. September the 11th, 2009. I wish Louis well, as I left him this morning. Would be a result if he contacted me, I thought. I'd love a cheap break to France, and a French pal to show me around. Oh, and the food would be amazing. Well, so I'd expect. I mean, can you imagine if you turned up and your first meal was egg and chips? It was grey and very wet, and I was probably going to get soaked today, especially with the amount of walking I was starting to become accustomed to. My legs and feet had started to constantly ache, but I was getting used to it. There was only one place to head to today. I caught the subway to the financial district, which is at the southern end of Manhattan. You know you're in the district because of the noticeable, taller, high-rise office buildings towering into the grey sky. I didn't know what to expect as I left the subway station. What would the mood be like, considering the date it was? To my surprise, it was a bit quieter than I expected. There were still plenty of people heading to work in the area, but I expected to see more people. As I walked through the area, I admired some of the older regal architecture and noticed how, with the grey sky, grey buildings and black umbrellas and raincoats, it all looked like a monochrome scene. As I continued on towards Ground Zero, I passed a homeless man. He told me to be careful of my camera in the rain. For a city that is always on the go, and a populace that, if not tourists, is much like London with everyone in a rush and not noticing anyone else, it caught me by surprise that this homeless man would notice me and not want me to ruin my camera with rainwater. It was a small gesture of caring which caught me off guard. Of course, I'm not naive to the fact that my camera could be robbed, and it was something I was very cautious of. Believe me, my guard was up regarding that, especially after yesterday's bag incident. But there was a sincerity in this man's words and in his eyes. His eyes that, to me, said they'd seen a lot of struggle. He had missing teeth, a thick black coat that was sodden through, and he was probably in his 50s. But to me, his face told a story without having to say a word. He asked for $1 for a hot drink. I gave him $1 and asked if I could take his picture. He made a great subject, choosing not to look directly into the camera but off across the street, as if lost in thought. He was a natural. Maybe he'd done that before. Perhaps he features in many photographers' portfolios. The rain continued to pour and seemed to aptly reflect the sadness as I approached one side of Ground Zero. Hundreds of people gathered along with hundreds of police, and the main area of Ground Zero was fenced off. Family members of the fallen and colleagues from the emergency services were allowed through into the area. I couldn't see the actual Ground Zero as it was covered by large blue boarding, like a building site, and the crowds at the memorial service were out of view. But there were large speakers dotted around and I could hear the names of the lost being read out. The list seemed endless and highlighted the extensive loss of life on that heartbreaking day. It was one of those days that you'll always remember where you were when it happened. I was working at the insurance company I'd just been made redundant from. There was a commotion in the office and I went up to the 12th floor to see what was going on. Any excuse to get off the phones for a bit, to be honest. Upstairs we had a small break area, a few tables and a TV in the corner on a shelf. There were a small group gathered round watching the TV to see live pictures of the two towers, smoke billowing from both of them. Some mentioned it was a terrorist attack. One colleague, I remember, a chap called Paul, was watching with his arms crossed but a hand covering his mouth, looking on in disbelief. He said that he was there visiting the Twin Towers as a tourist just a few months before with his girlfriend. I was a bit oblivious, if I'm honest. I didn't really know how significant these buildings were on the skyline. I didn't really know what the World Trade Center was. But I imagine it was strange seeing somewhere you'd been, something that remains in your memories, and still seem quite fresh, suddenly being the centre of the world news because of a horrific act of evil and the tragic loss of innocent lives happening right in front of our eyes. And yet, we were unaware of what was about to happen. We were back at our desks on the phones taking motor claims calls when we learned of the towers collapsing. We all knew this was a tragic event that would go down in history, and it was only the beginning of something bigger. Someone had attacked America. It was going to kick off. And when I spent the evening watching the news, talking to Adrian, from whom I was renting a room, I just couldn't stop thinking about all those lives lost and the amount of heartbreak rippling out at that very moment. And when I'd got up for work that morning, they'd all been in bed, next to their partners, some being near their families, and they all woke up and went through their normal morning routine, whilst I was already at work. And before my working day was over, they were gone. As I went to bed thinking about it, I remember wishing that there was some way to go back in time. And I know it's a stupid thought, but I wish that there was some way to go back and somehow warn them all. And back then, I had no idea that exactly 8 years later, I'd be at the very site, fully aware of what the Twin Towers were and what they represented. I remember looking up, trying to comprehend the sheer size of those 110-floor buildings in what was a relatively tight space. As the rain hit my face, I tried to look up and keep my eyes open, but it was difficult to do so, and difficult to imagine what the towers looked like from ground level. I was in a large crowd listening and paying respects, and behind us was a group with placards saying that it was an inside job and protesting. Whatever their viewpoint, I found this opportunistic attempt to be heard in poor taste. Today was about the many lives that were lost, and the families, friends and colleagues who continue to suffer the loss of those victims. Feeling sad, I decided to move on after a half hour or so. I hadn't eaten and my stomach was crying for food. I was also very wet now, and I needed to dry off somewhere. I headed over to a couple of policewomen who were sheltering from the rain under the cover of an entrance to another regal-looking building. One of these policewomen was really friendly and cool, if a little short. I was under the impression that the NYPD would be a certain type of officer. Large, burly, with a take-no-shit kind of attitude. But this officer, the one I was talking to, was tiny and more like a kind of Auntie Rita kind of character. Well, maybe she was a little pocket rocket and could take down any sized assailant. But then, of course, I remembered that triggers had no size requirement. I asked her where I could get a good bite to eat, and as we chatted, she asked where I was staying. I told her it was on the outskirts of Harlem. "Now, you don't want to be looking like a tourist when you walk around there," she said. There's one obvious problem with that, I thought. I am quite possibly the whitest man on the planet, and I don't think I'd exactly blend in unnoticed in Harlem. "If anybody tries to rob you, you give them your money, otherwise they'll shoot you in the face," she kindly told me. Nice, thanks. But there were still some more handy hints. "You catch the subway, you gotta stand well back from the edge, otherwise someone could push you in front of the fucking train." Really? "There's some crazy people in the city." To be honest, I hadn't read that in the guidebook. But then again, I hadn't really read the guidebook. But on the bright side, if I was still able to survive, I must try the Cold Stone ice cream, apparently. So I thanked her for her help, and feeling a little unnerved, as well as hungry and wet, I headed off to find somewhere to eat. After eating in a deli for about £3, I headed off in search of the Bodies exhibition over beside the East River. I wanted plenty of indoor things to do, courtesy of the New York Pass, as the weather was terrible. This exhibition wasn't done by the German Dr. Gunther von Hagens, who famously used real bodies dissected and treated with some form of plastic injection, infusion method thing, and then position them into various everyday positions. This was the same technique, but it was done by a Chinese doctor. I managed to latch onto a tour group who had a young Chinese doctor woman explain the various processes that they go through, and all the bodies were unclaimed Chinese people. I didn't like that idea. It sounded as though these people were items belonging to someone, handed into lost property and not collected or found by their rightful owner. It seemed to devalue the precious nature of human life. It was a bit weird to think that maybe less than a couple of years ago, these bodies were moving around, laughing, watching TV maybe, eating, talking, and everything else that a normal human being does. They loved, they laughed, they cried, and no doubt had hopes, dreams, regrets, and all the other baggage associated with being human. Maybe they even went to an exhibition like we were now, although, very different to this. I couldn't help wonder what they would have thought if they knew that their bodies would have been used in such a way. Permission wasn't given prior, so this seemed like exploitation to me. Well, I was here now. I may as well continue to look around. The bodies were stripped of the skin and were placed in different everyday positions, making their inner organs visible. Some bodies were just the nervous system or just the circulatory system, so although we were looking at real people, they weren't identifiable. Some bodies still had their eyebrows, eyelashes, and manky toenails. Don't get me wrong, it was great to see from an educational perspective, and it was also interesting to see the effects of smoking on different organs in the body. However, there was one area cordoned off which had viewer's discretion sign on it, and of course that just raises intrigue, doesn't it? What could that be? So I entered the area, but I didn't stay for long. It was a gallery of babies, including various stages of development in the womb. I was deeply saddened by the thought of the lost potential, the innocence, the vulnerability, and the questionable ethics behind such an act, to treat them like objects and place them behind glass for others to see. I felt sad, I felt sickened, I felt angry, and to be honest with you, I could have cried. The mood in that viewing area was sombre, to say the least. I wondered if others felt the same, but the silence was deafening. I couldn't stay in there any longer, so I left that area rather sharpish. After spending an hour or so at the exhibition feeling a bit curious and a bit guilty, and I left, heading back to the downpour, but taking shelter nearby at Pier 17. A collection of shops and places to eat with a great view of Brooklyn Bridge. Whilst wandering around outside under cover, I managed to take some decent shots, especially of the bridge. There was a little old man having his lunch. He looked like fish and chips. He was engrossed in his food. I thought he'd make a good subject, and part of the documenting this trip was to try to capture street photography and capture a genuine moment in time. That's what street photography is. It's capturing genuine moments in time to document something very real. I had my telephoto lens on, and being completely honest, I pretended to take shots of stairs and bicycles, and then I'd just take a quick shot of him. I was cautious that I didn't want to be obviously rude and intrusive. I started to take the approach that there's a world of real images out there for the taking, and I will only probably get this opportunity once. If I'm a supposedly keen photographer, I should be capturing as much as I could. A short time later, as the wind blew and the drizzle fell, I sat under cover on a bench next to a guy who worked in the financial district. He was very smart in his suit, and obviously this was a place to step away from the stress of work during his lunch break. We struck up a conversation, and he told me that he commutes for 2 hours a day each way. I couldn't comprehend that, but to have a nice home and support his family, I could appreciate his reasons. After a while, it becomes the norm, I guess. It made my 45 minutes into Birmingham city centre seem like nothing. After a wander around, some shots of Brooklyn Bridge, and a look through the shops, I headed off to find something to eat. I didn't want to wander too far. The rain was lashing down, and like an idiot, I hadn't brought my raincoat, so I was pretty soaked through. I remember crossing under an overpass of some sort, and again thinking how monochrome it seemed, with the grey concrete road under a grey concrete overpass, with grey water behind me and a grey pier, all under a grey sky. It was all very grey. I ended up in a restaurant called JP Mustard. Nothing fancy or special, but I had large portions and thought that I probably wouldn't need to eat later. I sat there by the window, very damp, watching the rain lash down, drinking a large coffee, eyeing up the waitress, and feeling very relaxed. Then every now and again it would hit me. I'm in New York, baby! It's good to sometimes wake up to the fact that this was real. You know, if you take everything in your stride, very relaxed, you risk not feeling anything and being numb to everything. The rain dropped off and I went for a wander again, and again I phoned my Auntie Carol. This time my bag was awkward to open, and this time Carol answered. It was so good to hear her voice. The last time I saw her, she cried, saying goodbye to me. She had good news as she'd just been offered a new job, having had a terrible time with her current employer. I remember shouting, "Woohoo!" down the phone, then feeling self-conscious looking around, but no one seemed to take any notice. Maybe it was a common occurrence to hear some random shouting woohoo down the phone in New York. As I was still within the financial district, I made my way to Wall Street to see the New York Stock Exchange building, but I must admit it was very different to what I was expecting. I expected a main road with lots of people and lots of traffic, but the buildings were all very close together. It seemed almost cramped and cluttered, and there were lots of police around. The buildings are very grand, and on the outside of the Stock Exchange building was a large American flag. I mean, it was huge. It dawned on me how patriotic and proud this country is of who they are. I thought to myself, we need more of that in the UK. Why haven't we got British flags all over the place? It is a nice flag, after all. I stood on the steps of the Federal Hall next to the statue of George Washington across the way from the Stock Exchange building and had my picture taken. As the weather was still shit, I jumped on the subway and began to make my way to another indoor activity courtesy of the New York Pass, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Now, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame wasn't exactly a grand building and it had quite a modest face in the light of what was inside. I got my ticket courtesy of the New York Pass and then was told to enter an area where there were names of bands on plaques, not much bigger than a house brick, all over the walls. They shut me in and I could hear music being played. The name of the band performing that track would light up on the wall, everything else in darkness. Then the volume and colour around that plaque would start to fade, as another plaque somewhere else would start to light up in another part of the room, as their famous track would start to fade in. Jimi Hendrix played as the Jimi Hendrix plaque lit up and then faded as the Rolling Stones track started to play and their name lit up. Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, Santana, and so on. The tracks got shorter and shorter, and it quickly got faster and faster, flicking between artists and bands, the room becoming a flicker of pink, blues, reds, yellows and purples from all different places, drawing your attention around the room, building up until it was a growing swell of noise and lights, and then suddenly a big ta-da! And then nothing. The music stopped. The lights went out and I'm just stood there in the dark on my own thinking, what the bloody hell's going on here? This must be part of it, surely. What now? What's all this big build-up led to? Then I heard a door latch, a creak of an unoiled hinge or two, and a spotty teenager stuck his head around the door. "This way, sir." Wow, I thought, talk about an anticlimax. All that build-up, bravado, flashing lights and musical rows to be greeted by Kevin, the spotty teenager, asking me to get a wriggle on. I enter a large room with stools everywhere in an arc formation, facing a large screen on the wall. I sat down and Kevin stood at the back with a look of, here we go again, on his face. The video played clips from various bands of the past with old footage of Led Zeppelin, The Who, Black Sabbath, the Rolling Stones, Jimi Hendrix and more, relishing me and Kevin with great earworm-inducing riffs. It captured the raucous energy that makes rock music so great. Then there was a black and white clip of some guitar god of the past. I didn't catch who it was. I think it was Jeff Beck doing a guitar solo from way back. Ah, bless, I thought. The intention was obvious. To have the current audience superimposed onto the screen to make it look like we, the audience, were actually in the crowd watching him shred like a demon. However, didn't quite have the same effect when Jeff is rocking out in front of his audience, which comprised of about 30 empty chairs and little old me in the middle. I remember laughing out loud as I just sat there, nodding my head to the tunes. It looked pretty pathetic, to be honest. The intention was to have the wow factor as people saw themselves on the screen with the guitar demon, but instead it looked like he may as well have been playing in my front room. I waved to myself. At the end of the film, I'm led by Kevin into a corridor and handed a headset. As I wander around the corridors looking at the various artifacts and memorabilia, the music in the headset would change accordingly. I thought this was an excellent touch to be listening to Elvis whilst you're looking at one of his jumpsuits, and then listen to Prince or Madonna or the Beatles as you reach their items. I enjoyed just taking my time looking around, and then I entered a vast space, a totally white room with 4 video screens and exhibits in lines in the centre of the room. There were a lot of people wandering around, and I remember taking my headset off just to experience what a room with so many silent people is like. It's a bit weird, because you can't help but expect some sound with that number of people milling about, and 4 large screens with lots of moving images and fast-paced footage all playing simultaneously. So much movement and action, and yet no sound. I was now in the John Lennon room. I'd never been into the Beatles or Lennon, and to be honest, I didn't really know much about him. I know I'm supposed to be a singer-songwriter, with no appreciation of the Beatles or Lennon. What a travesty. I don't care. But I must admit that as I wandered around from screen to screen and watched the videos with the sound through my headset, I had a really interesting insight into the musician, the artist, and the man himself, with his various stands making political statements of protest and his problems staying in the country. And of course, he lost his life in New York 6 months before I was born. I left the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and wondered what to do next. It was getting dark and the weather still wasn't great. I walked down the tree-lined streets through urban areas with cool little stores here and there. The houses were how I imagined the Cosby's house to resemble. Only successful folk could afford to live here. I noticed how the sodden streets reflected the lights of cars passing by. I decided I'd try to tick another box and go to a jazz club. How cool would that be? A jazz club in New York. Shit, I'm in New York. So again, I got lost and had to ask directions. I then got lost again and see a guy in a suit with trainers walking very fast towards me. I decided to ask him. This guy became affectionately known to me as the what the fuck guy. A proper New Yorker with a distinctive twang of Brooklyn. I couldn't help but smile as he assisted me in a friendly/aggressive manner. You looking for a jazz club? Oh, what the fuck? Carry on up here, and there's a number of fucking jazz clubs. Oh, what the fuck is the name of that fucking joint? What the fuck? There's one place, it's pretty good, but it's like 50 fucking bucks to get in there, you know? What the fuck is the name of that place? What the fuck? Just head up to Christopher, and there's fucking loads of jazz clubs up there. And he was gone. Power walking away from me at speed in his grey, damp power suit and trainers, and I couldn't help but smile every time he said, fuck. Thing is, I didn't know where Christopher was. I didn't know what street I was even on. But somehow, eventually, I found a number of clubs, but picked quite a modest little place, almost hidden away, and that appealed to me. I didn't know the name of it, but saw the neon sign saying live jazz and headed in there. It was a small and dark and intimate place with posters, pictures, musical memorabilia, signs and old photos all over the walls. It was the kind of place that had so much character that you never grow tired of just looking around, you know. It had a real nice vibe to it with a browny, reddish hue, making it feel warm and welcoming. At the back of the joint, you see I'm using the lingo now, the joint, was a Japanese lady, Erin Yamamoto, playing piano with a drummer and a double bass player. It was what looked like Christmas lights draped over the back wall, and I sat at the bar because to me that's the cool place to sit, right? You're on your own, you sit at the bar. I was greeted by a beast of a woman. Hugely framed, she resembled a contender for world's strongest man. With her long hair, from behind, she could be mistaken for Conan the Barbarian. She looked like she could quite easily handle herself. Her deep voice bellowed as she approached me. I felt myself shrink in my seat as she towered over me. "There's a 2-drink minimum here," she bellowed. "Okay," I responded in a feeble, small, Englishman kind of way. $10 for a bottle of Bud. Oh well, I thought, at least it was freeing. I'll just take my time and chill out and, keep well out of the way of the scary lady. If I'm honest, the music was a bit random at times and I struggled to follow, but, that said, it was still enjoyable. I started to write my journal when Xena Warrior Princess comes over and grunts, "Hey, what you writing there?" Inside, I'm saying, "Please don't hurt me." But I responded with a nervous, it's just my journal," which got the nod from Xena, and she carried on doing her manly thing. I don't know what she thought I could be. It was almost as if she was worried that I was some sort of jazz club critic. There's no way I'd criticise that place anyway. I mean, I couldn't go on thinking that Xena would hunt me down and crush my face in the big calloused palm of one hand and rip my testicles off with the other. I looked around and noticed a couple of butch ladies, sitting and holding hands, enjoying the music. Then I noticed another couple, and then I saw the rainbow flag on the wall. Yeah, all kind of made sense now. Hence the sturdy girl behind the bar. I'd entered a lesbian jazz club. Of all the jazz clubs in all of New York, and I find a lesbian one. Now, I'm not prudish about anything like that, but I did think to myself, well, that's novel. I got chatting to a guy called Yohal and his wife, Lisa, who sat beside me at the bar. They were really nice people and also musicians. I played some music to Lisa with my iPod, but Yohal was a bit funny about sharing earphones with people. So, suit yourself, Yohal, your loss. They took my MySpace address and said they'd be very keen to buy my CD off iTunes. Now, I don't think they ever did. I don't know, maybe they were one of the 4 purchases. They said they'd be in touch and then went and sat at the front. Now, talk is cheap, and although at times people say things and never come through with the goods, it's nice just to have an interaction with people and have that connection through a common interest such as music. After my second beer, I headed back to my bunk in a box. Someone else had moved into the bottom bunk, although they were out. Judging by the name tag on the hideous bright red rain mac hanging up, I guess they must be German. I got my head down with my earplugs in, because the Italian kids were again being a bit rowdy. And there you go. So that was day 3. Quite an emotional day, wasn't it, really? Obviously, with it being September the 11th, and to go to Ground Zero on the day and remember the lost and to just feel that, the collective grief. And then the other emotional bit for me was being in the bodies exhibition, and ethically, it just didn't sit well with me at all. And of course, the babies bit was just really heartbreaking. So I had a couple of funny interactions. Obviously, there's the lady, the female NYPD. Don't get shot in the face. Thanks, lady. Fortunately, I didn't get shot in the face, and I didn't get robbed. Someone tried to get in my bag, but not now because I've got the little tangled up the toggle thing on my zips. Yeah, I've got that down now. Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. How bizarre was that? I mean, talk about anticlimax. And then I had the What the Fuck guy. That was good. Xena Warrior Princess. Scary. Lesbian jazz bar. I didn't even know that sort of thing existed. I knew there were gay bars. Obviously, I'm not completely naive. But I never thought that they kind of have different disciplines. Why not? Why not? Why not specialise? Lesbian country and western bar, or lesbian bell ringers. I don't know. Maybe that's a thing. If not, gap in the market. You can have that one. You're welcome. So I hope you enjoyed that. And details will be on, photos will be on, or what I could take, with it being a terrible rainy day, will be on onlyaslowly.wordpress.com. Please like it, share it, spread the word, and thank you for listening. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and I look forward to seeing you on day 4. Thank you. Don't get shot in the face! What the fuck?